An ex-soldier stood up for a bullied kid, unaware the boy would later save his life in battle. The moment happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind that usually blended into the fabric of forgettable days, but instead became the first stitch in a tapestry that would stretch across years, connecting two souls through time and circumstance. James Connor hadn't meant to be a hero that day. At 34, his days of heroism felt long behind him. 3 years removed from active duty, he still carried Afghanistan in the slight limp in his right leg and the nightmares that arrived with cruel punctuality at 3 a.m. The war had taken pieces of him, some visible, most not. It was raining when he saw it happening. The kind of autumn rain that seemed determined to wash away summer's last traces, cold and relentless. James stood beneath the awning of Foster's grocery, paper bag clutched against his chest, watching 3 teenage boys circle a smaller one like wolves around wounded prey. The smaller boy, no more than 12, with glasses too large for his face and a backpack that seemed to swallow his narrow shoulders, pressed himself against the brick wall of the alley beside the grocery store. His eyes darted between his tormentors, calculating odds that James knew were impossible. "Give it up, freak," the tallest of the 3 demanded, shoving the boy hard enough that his glasses slipped down his nose. James felt something stir inside him, a familiar heat he hadn't felt since his last deployment. Before he realized what he was doing, his groceries sat abandoned on the wet sidewalk, and he was crossing the street. "Hey!" The word came out harsher than he'd intended, dragging the attention of all 4 boys toward him. The rain plastered his dark hair against his forehead, but he barely noticed. "That's enough." The tallest boy, 16, maybe 17, straightened his shoulders in that universal posture of teenage defiance. "Mind your own business, mister." James stepped closer, letting something of the soldier he once was surface in his eyes. "I'm making it my business." Something in his voice, or perhaps his eyes, made the boy hesitate. James knew that look. He'd seen it on the faces of men who suddenly realized they'd miscalculated a situation. The tallest boy glanced at his friends, defiance wavering. "Whatever, man. He's not worth it anyway." They backed away, tossing parting insults that landed as weakly as the raindrops now easing around them. When they disappeared around the corner, James turned to the smaller boy, who was hastily trying to stuff something back into his backpack, a notebook, its pages wrinkled and damp at the edges. "You okay, kid?" James asked, softening his voice. The boy nodded, pushing his glasses back up his nose with a trembling finger. "Thanks." His voice was barely audible above the rain's patter. "What's your name?" "Michael." "Michael Tanner." The boy clutched his backpack straps like a lifeline. James nodded, feeling the awkwardness that often followed these kinds of interventions. He wasn't good with kids, not anymore. Once, perhaps, in another life. "They bother you often?" Michael shrugged, a gesture that spoke volumes in its resignation. "It's fine." "It's not," James said simply. Something in the boy's eyes shifted then. Surprise, perhaps, that an adult had disagreed with his acceptance of cruelty as normal. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, filled only by the steadying rhythm of the rain. "Look, James began, just as Michael said, "I should." They both stopped. The ghost of a smile touched the boy's lips. "You need a ride home?" James finally asked, retrieving his now soaked grocery bag from the sidewalk. Michael shook his head. "I live just 2 blocks that way." He pointed east. "My mom would freak if I got in a car with a stranger anyway." James nodded, appreciating the kid's caution. "Smart. But I'll walk with you, if that's okay. Make sure those jerks don't circle back." The look on Michael's face, a mixture of relief and wariness, made something ache in James's chest. "Okay," Michael said simply. They walked in silence for half a block before Michael spoke again. "Were you really a soldier?" James glanced down, surprised. "How'd you know that?" Michael's eyes flicked to James's right hand, where it gripped the damp paper bag. "The way you hold yourself, and that thing you do with your hand." When James looked confused, Michael demonstrated, thumb absently brushing against fingers in a counting motion. "My uncle was in Iraq. He does that too." James hadn't realized he still carried that habit. A silent count of his team, ingrained after years of making sure everyone was accounted for. 1, 2, 3, 4, over and over, even when there was no one left to count. "Afghanistan," James said finally. "Suriname, 3 tours." Michael nodded as if this confirmed something important. "That's why they backed off. They could tell." "Tell what?" "That you've seen worse than them." The simple perception in those words left James momentarily speechless. They reached a modest apartment building, its brick facade darkened by the rain. Michael stopped at the entrance, adjusting his backpack. "This is me," he said, eyes dropping to the wet sidewalk. "Thanks again, Mr. Sir Connor." "James Connor." "Thanks, Mr. Connor." James nodded, suddenly uncertain how to end this unexpected interaction. "Those boys, if they keep bothering you..." "It's fine," Michael interrupted, the resignation returning to his voice. "It happens." "It shouldn't," James said firmly. He hesitated, then pulled a receipt from his pocket and scrawled his phone number on the back. "If it gets bad, call me." "Okay?" Michael stared at the paper, confusion evident in the furrow of his brow. "Why?" The question caught James off guard. Why indeed? He didn't know this kid, had no obligation to him, but something in those resigned eyes struck a chord that resonated with the hollow places inside him. "Because someone should have your back," he said simply. Michael took the paper carefully, as if it might disintegrate in his fingers. "Okay," he said, and for the first time, a genuine smile touched his face. "Thanks." James watched as Michael disappeared into the building, feeling an odd sense of accomplishment that had become rare in his post-military life. It was such a small thing, really, stepping between a kid and some bullies, nothing compared to what he'd done in his former life. Yet somehow it felt significant in a way he couldn't articulate. As he turned to walk home, the rain finally stopping, James Connor had no way of knowing that this small act of kindness had set wheels in motion that would, years later, come full circle in the most unexpected way. The boy with the two large glasses would become more than a random kid he'd helped on a rainy afternoon. Much more. But that was a story yet to unfold. The nightmares came as they always did, dragging James from sleep at 3:17 a.m., the same time the IED had torn through their convoy, leaving two dead and James with a leg full of shrapnel and a heart full of survivor's guilt. He sat up, sheets tangled around his legs, sweat cold on his skin, despite the September chill seeping through his apartment windows. For a moment he was still there, dust in his mouth, screams in his ears, the copper scent of blood thick in his nostrils. Then slowly his bedroom came back into focus. Plain walls, sparse furniture. The digital clock's red numbers, 3:19 a.m. Home, safe, alone. James pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes, willing the remnants of the dream to dissolve. It had been particularly vivid tonight, Ramirez's face clear as day, caught in that frozen moment of realization before the blast. Sleep would not return, he knew from experience. James swung his legs over the edge of the bed, wincing as his right leg protested. The weather change always made the old wounds ache, a constant reminder of what he'd lost and what he'd brought home. He made coffee in the dark, watching the city through his kitchen window as it slept on, oblivious to his private war. 3 years back in civilian life, and he still felt like a ghost moving through a world that had continued without him. The VA counselor called it adjustment disorder with depressed mood. James called it being hollowed out, scrubbed clean of purpose. The construction job paid the bills, gave his hands something to do, but it didn't fill the void left when he turned in his uniform. By 6, he was dressed and out the door, the lingering nightmare driving him to move, to walk off the memories before they could sink their claws in deeper. The morning was cool but clear, the rain from yesterday leaving everything with a fresh, washed gleam. He walked without direction, letting his feet carry him through neighborhoods just beginning to stir. Somehow, he wasn't surprised when he found himself passing the apartment building where he'd left Michael the day before. It was early, too early for a kid to be heading to school, but as he approached, he spotted a familiar figure sitting on the front steps, hunched over a notebook. Michael looked up as James's footsteps slowed, recognition flashing in his eyes. He quickly closed the notebook, a wariness shadowing his face. "You stalking me or something?" The question held more curiosity than fear. James shook his head, hands sliding into his jacket pockets. "Just walking." Couldn't sleep." Something in Michael's expression softened, as if he understood the kind of sleeplessness that drove a person from their bed before dawn. "Me neither." He gestured to the step beside him. "You can sit if you want." "I don't mind." James hesitated, then eased himself down, careful to leave space between them. "School doesn't start for a couple hours, does it?" Michael shrugged. "Mom has early shifts at the hospital. Sometimes it's easier to just not be in the apartment." He traced a finger over his notebook cover, which James now saw was decorated with intricate pencil drawings of what looked like spaceships and stars. "You like space?" James asked, nodding toward the notebook. Michael's entire demeanor changed, caution giving way to enthusiasm. "Yeah, Astronomy mostly, but also sci-fi. I'm working on a story about the first Mars colony. His cheeks reddened slightly, as if expecting ridicule. That's cool, James said, meaning it. I used to read sci-fi when I was deployed. Helped to escape for a while, you know. Michael studied him with those perceptive eyes. Is that why you're out walking so early? To escape? The question was so direct, so unexpected, that James found himself answering honestly. Sometimes the memories get loud. Walking helps. Michael nodded as if this made perfect sense. Mom says I overthink things, that my brain doesn't have an off switch. He tapped his notebook. This helps me, making up stories where I get to decide what happens. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. A paper delivery car cruised by. Lights flickered on in windows across the street. Those guys from yesterday, James said finally. What was that about? Michael's shoulders tensed. Just the usual. I'm weird, I like books too much. I don't shut up about space. He attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Take your pick. People can be cruel about things they don't understand, James said quietly. Or things that make them feel stupid, Michael added with surprising insight. James looked at the boy with new appreciation. 12 years old and already figuring out the darker motivations of human behavior. You're pretty smart, aren't you? Michael shrugged again. That's part of the problem. Teachers always want me to share with the class, and it just makes everything worse. He glanced at James. Did you have it hard in school? James thought back to his own school days. He hadn't been the target of bullies. Football had provided a shield of protection, but he remembered the kids who were. How he looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to step in. The memory sat uncomfortably in his chest. I was okay, he said finally, but I didn't do enough to help the kids who weren't. Something passed between them then, a recognition perhaps of shared understanding. James saw in Michael's eyes a wisdom beyond his years, born of isolation and observation from the edges of his world. I should get ready for school, Michael said eventually, standing and tucking his notebook into his backpack. He hesitated then. Will you be walking this way again? You know, if you can't sleep? The question caught James off guard. Maybe. Would that be okay? Michael nodded, the ghost of a genuine smile touching his lips. Yeah, it would be okay. As James watched the boy disappear into the building, he felt something shift inside him. A small realignment, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. For the first time in months, he found himself looking forward to something. It wasn't much, just the possibility of conversation with a thoughtful kid who saw too much. But it felt like the beginning of something. A thin thread of connection in a life that had been defined by disconnection. James walked home with lighter steps. The nightmare's grip loosened, if only temporarily. Over the next few weeks, a routine formed without either of them acknowledging it. 3 or 4 mornings a week, James would find himself walking past Michael's building around 6:30 a.m., and more often than not, Michael would be on the steps with his notebook. They would sit together for 15 or 20 minutes, talking about everything and nothing. Michael's latest space story, a documentary James had watched, the changing leaves on the maple trees lining the street. James found himself looking up astronomy facts the night before their meetings, just to see Michael's face light up with excitement when he brought them up. He learned that Michael's father had left when the boy was 4, that his mother worked double shifts as a nurse to keep them afloat, that Michael dreamed of working for NASA one day. In turn, James shared carefully edited stories from his time in service. The camaraderie, the strange beauty of Afghanistan's mountains at dawn, the stray dog his unit had adopted and named Lieutenant Dan. He kept the darkness at bay in these tellings, aware of Michael's age but also sensing the boy would see through any sanitized version of war. One brisk October morning, Michael wasn't on the steps when James arrived. The absence created an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. He was about to continue walking when the apartment building door burst open and Michael rushed out, backpack half-zipped and glasses slightly askew. Sorry, he panted. Overslept. Mom's gonna kill me if I'm late to Mrs. Peterson's class again. James found himself offering before he'd fully thought it through. I could give you a ride to school. My truck's just a few blocks away. Michael hesitated, obviously torn between his mother's warnings about strangers and the weeks of morning conversations that had made James decidedly not a stranger anymore. Okay, he decided, but I should leave Mom a note. She checks her phone between patients. While Michael scribbled a note and slipped it under their apartment door, James texted his foreman that he'd be running late. The construction site would survive without him for an hour. The drive to Michael's middle school was filled with the boys' enthusiastic description of a meteor shower expected that weekend. It's supposed to be visible even with city light pollution, he explained, hands gesturing to illustrate his point. Mom said she'd try to stay awake for it, but she'll be coming off a 12-hour shift, so... The resignation in his voice made James glance over. You were going to watch it alone? Michael shrugged, that now familiar gesture that minimized his disappointments. It's fine. I've got an app that tracks them. There'll be another one in December. James pulled up outside the school, watching students stream toward the entrance. Michael gathered his backpack, hesitating before opening the door. Thanks for the ride, mister. Connor. James, he corrected automatically. After weeks of conversations, the formality felt strange. Michael smiled slightly. Thanks, James. He climbed out but paused, one hand on the door. Those guys don't bother me as much now. Chamonum. Just so you know. Good, James said, feeling a disproportionate sense of relief. But the offer still stands if you need backup. Michael nodded and closed the door, hurrying toward the school entrance. James watched until the boy disappeared inside, struck by the fierce protectiveness he felt. There was something about Michael, his quiet resilience, his brilliant mind housed in that vulnerable frame, that resonated deeply with James. For so long after returning home, James had felt purposeless, adrift in a civilian world that seemed to have no place for what he'd been, what he'd done. But these morning conversations had become an anchor point in his week, a small but significant reason to push through the night's demons. As he drove to the construction site, James realized with a start that it had been nearly 2 weeks since his last major nightmare. The dreams still came, but they'd softened somehow, lost some of their razor-sharp edges. He wasn't naive enough to think a few conversations with a precocious 12-year-old had cured his PTSD, but there was something healing in those moments, in being seen, in mattering to someone again, even in this small way. That night, he found himself researching the meteor shower Michael had mentioned. He noted the optimal viewing time, 1:30 a.m. Saturday, and the best viewing direction. Before he could talk himself out of it, he texted the number Michael had eventually given him for emergencies. Meteor shower Saturday night. I've got a camping spot outside the city with less light pollution. Interested? Your mom's welcome too, of course. He stared at the sent message, suddenly unsure. Was this crossing a line? He was just trying to be kind to a kid who reminded him of himself at that age. Curious, isolated, hungry for connection. But from the outside, would it seem strange? A single man in his 30s befriending a 12-year-old boy? His phone buzzed with a response. For real? That would be awesome. Mom's working, but she knows about you. Says you're her hero for walking me to school that time. I'll ask her. James felt tension release from his shoulders. Michael's mother knew about him. Their conversations weren't some secret the boy was keeping. That mattered. 2 days later, with written permission from Michael's mother tucked in his wallet, James drove them 40 minutes outside the city limits to a clearing he'd discovered during one of his longer weekend hikes. They set up camp chairs and a small propane heater against the October chill and laid out blankets on the ground. This is amazing, Michael breathed, head tilted back to take in the vast sweep of stars above them, clearer than they ever appeared in the city. Look, you can actually see the Milky Way. James followed his gaze, struck by the beauty he'd almost forgotten existed in the world. In Afghanistan, the night skies had been breathtaking, but he'd rarely had the luxury of appreciating them. Always watching for threats, for movement, for danger. Now he could simply look up and marvel. When the meteors began streaking across the sky, bright flashes of light against the darkness, Michael's excitement was palpable. He counted each one aloud, occasionally explaining the science behind their appearance, with the unself-conscious enthusiasm only a 12-year-old could muster. Did you know they're not actually stars? He asked, eyes still fixed upward. They're just tiny bits of space dust burning up in our atmosphere. But some of them started out in comets that are older than human civilization. That's incredible, James said, genuinely fascinated. So we're basically watching ancient space dust die? Michael grinned. That's kind of poetic, isn't it? They spend millions of years traveling through space, and we get to see the moment they become part of Earth. In that moment, watching Michael's face illuminated by starlight, animated with wonder, James felt something inside him shift and settle. This, he realized, was what had been missing since his return. Not just purpose, but wonder. The ability to see beauty in the world again, to feel connected to something larger than his pain, his regrets, his losses. A particularly bright meteor streaked overhead, leaving a trail that lingered for several seconds. Michael gasped, grabbing James's arm in excitement. "Did you see that one? That was probably the size of a marble when it hit the atmosphere." James nodded, smiling at the boy's enthusiasm. "Make a wish. That's what you're supposed to do, right?" Michael closed his eyes briefly, face solemn with concentration, then opened them again. "This done. What did you wish for?" James asked. "Can't tell or it won't come true," Michael said seriously. "That's the rule." They fell silent, watching more meteors streak across the sky, fewer now as the shower began to wane. The night air had grown colder, their breath visible in small clouds. "James." Michael's voice was quieter now, thoughtful. "Sakakimiyama, thanks for bringing me here. Nobody's ever done something like this for me before." The simple gratitude in those words caught in James's chest, a warm ache spreading beneath his sternum. "You're welcome, kiddo. I'm glad we came." As they packed up later, meteors still occasionally flashing overhead, James realized he felt more at peace than he had in years. The constant tension he carried in his shoulders had eased. The hypervigilance that kept him scanning for threats had softened into simple awareness of the beauty around them. It wouldn't last, he knew. The nightmares would return. The memories would ambush him in unguarded moments. But for tonight, watching a meteor shower with a boy who saw wonder in the universe had given him something precious, a glimpse of healing, a reminder that life could still hold moments of pure, uncomplicated joy. And that perhaps was worth fighting for. Winter arrived with a vengeance, transforming their morning meetings. Instead of the apartment steps, they now met at a small coffee shop halfway between their homes. James would arrive first, ordering hot chocolate for Michael and black coffee for himself, claiming their usual corner table by the window. The ritual had expanded beyond just mornings. Some afternoons, James would pick Michael up from school, and they'd go to the library, where Michael would dive into astronomy books while James caught up on reading he'd neglected for years. Occasionally, they'd see a science fiction movie, arguing good-naturedly afterward about scientific inaccuracies or plot holes. Michael's mother, Elaine, had initially been cautious, meeting James several times, asking careful questions about his background and intentions. But as the weeks passed, her wariness gave way to genuine gratitude. "He talks about you constantly," she told James one evening when he dropped Michael off after a museum exhibit on space exploration. "I haven't seen him this happy in years." James understood what she didn't say, that raising a brilliant, sensitive boy alone was exhausting, that working 60-hour weeks left little energy for meteor showers and museums, that seeing her son find a mentor eased some of her constant worry. For James, the friendship filled a void he hadn't fully acknowledged. The construction work paid his bills, but his interactions with Michael gave his days meaning. He found himself researching topics Michael mentioned, looking for events they might attend, even joining a veteran mentorship program at the VA counselor's suggestion. "You seem different," his counselor observed during a session in early December. "More engaged." James nodded, surprising himself with a small smile. "I've been sleeping better," he admitted. "Not perfect, but better." The nightmares still came, but less frequently. When they did, he developed a new coping mechanism, texting Michael a question about space, something that required research. By morning, there would invariably be a lengthy, enthusiastic response waiting, often sent during Michael's own bouts of sleeplessness. These exchanges became their private code, a way of saying "I had a bad night" without the words, a lifeline thrown into the darkness. It was 2 weeks before Christmas when everything changed. They were leaving the coffee shop after their usual morning meeting, when James noticed the three boys from that first day, huddled on the corner, watching Michael with undisguised malice. Michael tensed beside him, eyes fixed firmly on the sidewalk. "Hey, science freak," the tallest one called. "Found yourself a boyfriend?" James felt Michael flinch, saw the color drain from his face. The casual cruelty of the taunt ignited something protective in his chest. "Ignore them," he murmured, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder. "They're just trying to get a reaction." But the boys weren't finished. They stepped into their path, smirking confidence in their faces. "Seriously, what's the deal?" the ringleader asked, looking between them with exaggerated confusion. "Is he like your dad or something?" "Oh wait, you don't have a dad. He left because you're such a weird little—" "That's enough," James interrupted, voice low and controlled, the tone he'd used with new recruits who needed to understand boundaries immediately. "Or what?" The challenge came with a step forward into James's space. The boy was tall for his age, but still a child compared to James's 6-foot frame. Yet there was something in his eyes, a hardness, a willingness to escalate that James recognized from men twice his age. "Todd, maybe we should," one of the other boys began, clearly uncomfortable with challenging an adult. "Shut up," Todd snapped, not taking his eyes off James. "He can't do anything. I bet he's just some pervert who—" James never learned what accusation would have followed. At that moment, Michael lunged forward with a speed that caught everyone by surprise, shoving Todd with enough force to make him stumble back. "Don't talk about him like that," Michael's voice cracked with emotion. "He's a war hero, and you're just a pathetic bully who—" Todd recovered quickly, face flushing with humiliation and rage. He swung wildly, his fist connecting with Michael's jaw before James could intervene. Michael crashed to the sidewalk, glasses skittering across the concrete. What happened next occurred in a heartbeat but felt suspended in time. James moved without conscious thought, combat training taking over. He stepped between Michael and Todd, grabbing the boy's wrist as he prepared to swing again. In one fluid motion, he redirected Todd's momentum, spinning him around and pinning his arm behind his back. A standard restraint technique he'd used countless times. "Stop," James said evenly, applying just enough pressure to make his point without causing pain. "Now," Todd struggled briefly, then went still, fear finally registering in his young face. His friends backed away, hands raised as if to distance themselves from the situation. "Let him go." A woman's voice cut through the tension. An older woman had emerged from the coffee shop, phone in hand. "I'm calling the police." James immediately released Todd, taking a step back, hands visible. "Ma'am, this boy just assaulted my friend. I was restraining him, not hurting him." But he could see the scene through her eyes. A grown man physically engaging with a teenager, regardless of the reason. Todd, sensing advantage, immediately adopted an expression of wounded innocence. "He attacked me," Todd said, voice trembling with manufactured fear. "I was just walking by and he grabbed me. My arm really hurts." "That's not true," Michael protested, scrambling to his feet, a bruise already forming on his jaw. "They started it. They always start it." James felt the situation slipping beyond his control. The woman was already speaking to emergency services, describing a large man assaulting a teenager. Pedestrians were slowing, watching the scene unfold with wary curiosity. "Michael," James said quietly, "call your mom." Michael nodded, hands shaking as he pulled out his phone. Todd and his friends had retreated to what they deemed a safe distance, but remained watching. Todd now holding his arm as if it were injured. By the time police arrived 10 minutes later, a small crowd had gathered. The officer, a young patrolman named Rodriguez, separated everyone, taking statements individually. James explained the situation as calmly and clearly as he could, highlighting that he'd used a restraint technique specifically designed to prevent injury. "I was military," he explained. 3 tours in Afghanistan. I reacted on instinct when I saw Michael get hit, but I didn't hurt the boy." Officer Rodriguez nodded, making notes. "Any witnesses who saw the entire confrontation?" "Just us and them," James admitted, heart sinking. It would be his and Michael's word against 3 teenagers and an older woman who'd only seen the aftermath. "He has PTSD, Todd was saying loudly to another officer nearby. "He freaked out and thought I was a terrorist or something. My dad's lawyer says people like that are ticking time bombs." James felt his stomach turn to ice. This was exactly the scenario veterans feared. One moment of reaction branded as unstable behavior, confirmation of the damaged vet stereotype. Elaine arrived as the officers were finishing their reports, rushing to check Michael's face with gentle, practiced hands. When Michael explained what had happened, her expression hardened. "That Todd has been tormenting Michael for 2 years, she told Officer Rodriguez. "The school has done nothing despite multiple reports. James was just protecting my son." Rodriguez's expression remained professional, but sympathetic. "No one's being charged at this point, but there will be a report filed." "Sir," he addressed James directly, "I'd advise you to let the school and authorities handle any future incidents." The implication was clear: stay away from this situation. James nodded, the familiar weight of isolation settling back onto his shoulders. As the crowd dispersed and the officers left, Elaine insisted on taking Michael to urgent care to check his jaw. "Will you come with us?" she asked James, surprising him. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" he asked quietly. "After all this," her eyes softened. "James, you were protecting my son. Of course I want you there." But as they walked to their cars, James caught sight of the coffee shop owner, watching from the doorway. Concern and suspicion mingled in her expression. The woman who'd called the police was speaking with another customer, both glancing his way with undisguised wariness. Just like that, his hard-won place in the community felt tenuous again. The ex-soldier who couldn't control himself. The damaged veteran who posed a risk to children. The narrative wrote itself, regardless of truth. At the urgent care center, while Michael was being examined, James sat in the waiting room, the morning's events replaying in his mind. He should have handled it differently, should have de-escalated, should have walked away, should have called for help instead of engaging. All the things his VA group discussed about civilian reintegration. But when he'd seen Michael fall, something primal had overridden all that careful training. The instinct to protect had been immediate and overwhelming. His phone buzzed with a text from his foreman. "Everything okay? Woman called the site asking about you. Something about police at the coffee shop?" James closed his eyes briefly. News traveled fast in small communities. By tomorrow, everyone at the construction site would have heard some version of the story. When Elaine emerged from the exam room, her expression told him everything he needed to know. "Just bruising," she said, relief evident in her voice. "No fracture." "That's good," James said, standing. "Elaine, I'm sorry about what happened." "I shouldn't have—" "Stop," she interrupted gently. "Michael told me everything. You stepped in when those boys were saying horrible things. You tried to walk away. You only restrained that boy after he hit Michael." She touched his arm, her nurse's eyes seeing the tension he carried. "You have nothing to apologize for." But as Michael joined them, butterfly bandage on his jaw and subdued expression on his face, James knew something fundamental had changed. The simplicity of their friendship had been complicated by outside perceptions, by the scene at the coffee shop, by the reality of who he was and what he carried. "Can we still go to the planetarium this weekend?" Michael asked as they walked to the parking lot, his voice small but hopeful. James looked to Elaine, who nodded encouragingly. "Sure, buddy," he said, forcing a smile. "If it's still okay with your mom." But even as he said it, James felt the distance beginning to form. A protective barrier he was already building, not just for himself, but for Michael. The boy didn't deserve to be associated with someone the community viewed as unstable or dangerous. He didn't deserve the whispers, the questions, the stigma that James had grown accustomed to carrying. That night, alone in his apartment, James made a decision that felt like tearing open a wound that had just begun to heal. He would step back, not disappear entirely, that would only hurt Michael more, but create enough distance to protect the boy from being tainted by association. It was the right thing to do, the necessary thing. So why did it feel like losing everything all over again? Surreal. The weeks that followed were an exercise in careful withdrawal. James still met Michael occasionally, but always in public places with plenty of witnesses. He invented excuses to shorten their outings, pleading work commitments or VA appointments. He stopped offering rides, stopped suggesting activities, responding to Michael's ideas with vague, "maybe later," or "we'll see." Michael noticed, of course he did. The hurt in his eyes when James begged off their weekly library trip was almost unbearable. The confused text messages asking if he'd done something wrong made James's chest ache with a physical pain. But he persisted, convinced that the temporary hurt was worth the long-term protection. The nightmares returned with a vengeance, as if sensing the vulnerability created by this self-imposed isolation. James's VA counselor noted the backslide with concern. "You've stopped mentioning Michael," she observed during a January session. "Did something happen?" James explained the coffee shop incident in clinical terms, minimizing his own emotional response. "So you're protecting him," she summarized when he finished. "By removing yourself. It's for the best," James insisted. "The last thing that kid needs is to be associated with someone the town sees as unstable." "Is that how the town sees you, James? Or is that how you see yourself?" The question hung between them, uncomfortable in its accuracy. Before he could formulate a response, his phone buzzed with a text. "Michael again. The third this week. Can we please talk? I don't understand what I did wrong." James stared at the message, throat tight. "I just wanted to help him," he said finally, not looking up. "Instead, I'm hurting him more." "You stepped into his life when he needed someone," his counselor said gently. "That remains true. But relationships can't be one-directional. Have you considered that maybe he's been helping you too? That perhaps he needs to feel that connection as much as you do?" The thought lingered with James long after the session ended. He'd been so focused on what he thought was best for Michael that he disregarded the boy's own needs and choices. At 12, Michael was young, yes, but he was also remarkably perceptive and resilient. He'd been navigating difficult situations long before James entered his life. That evening, James finally responded to Michael's text. "I'm sorry. You didn't do anything wrong. Can we meet tomorrow morning? Regular spot?" The reply came almost instantly. Yes. 6:30? Something tight in James's chest loosened slightly. Sounds good. I'll bring the hot chocolate. The coffee shop was nearly empty when they met the next morning, the December chill keeping most customers in bed on a Saturday. Michael arrived bundled in a coat too large for his frame, cheeks red from the cold, eyes cautious behind his glasses. Hey, James said, pushing a hot chocolate across the table. Thanks for coming. Michael slid into the chair, hands immediately wrapping around the warm cup. I thought you were avoiding me because of what happened. Because I messed up and made those guys mad. The guilt in his voice made James wince. No, Michael, that wasn't it at all. I was worried that being around me might cause problems for you. After what people saw, what they might think. That's stupid, Michael said bluntly with the direct honesty of youth. You helped me. You always help me. James smiled despite himself. Maybe it was stupid. I've been told I can be thick-headed sometimes. My mom says you're the best thing that's happened to me in years. Michael took a sip of his hot chocolate, leaving a whipped cream mustache he hastily wiped away. She was worried when you started disappearing. She thought maybe your PTSD was getting bad again. The observation, so matter-of-fact and yet so perceptive, caught James off guard. Your mom talks to you about my PTSD? Michael shrugged. Not really, but I've read about it. The hypervigilance, the nightmares, the isolation. I noticed things. He glanced up, expression serious beyond his years. When you don't answer texts for days, I worry that you're having a really bad time. The role reversal, a 12-year-old worrying about him, should have felt wrong. Instead, it illuminated something James had been missing. Their relationship wasn't one-sided. It never had been. Michael drew strength and support from their friendship, yes, but he also gave those things in return, in his own way. I'm sorry, James said simply. I thought I was protecting you. I didn't realize I was just hurting both of us. Michael nodded, accepting the apology with a maturity that continued to surprise James. So we're okay again. No more disappearing? No more disappearing, James promised. And I was thinking, there's a Veterans Day program coming up at my old base next month. They're doing demonstrations, helicopter tours, that kind of thing. I could get passes if you're interested. The light that returned to Michael's eyes was answer enough. As winter gave way to spring, their routine gradually returned to normal. The coffee shop incident faded from local memory, replaced by newer gossip. James found work on a different construction site, one closer to Michael's school, allowing him to occasionally meet the boy for lunch. Their friendship deepened, weathered by the brief separation and stronger for having survived it. In April, as Michael's 13th birthday approached, James found himself facing an unexpected question from Elaine. He wants to join JROTC when he starts high school next year, she said during one of their now regular check-ins. He says it's because he's interested in military technology and discipline, but I think it's because of you. James felt a complicated mix of pride and concern. Do you want me to talk him out of it? Elaine sighed, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. I want him to make his own choices, but I'm also his mother, and the thought of him eventually following that path. She didn't finish the sentence, but her eyes flicked to James's leg, to the scars visible on his forearms, to the shadows that sometimes claimed his expression without warning. I'll talk to him, James promised, not to discourage him, but to make sure he understands what he's considering. The real version, not the recruitment poster. The conversation with Michael happened during a weekend fishing trip, their first overnight excursion since the meteor shower months earlier. Under a canopy of stars beside a small campfire, James shared the unvarnished truth of military service. The camaraderie and purpose, yes, but also the moral complexity, the trauma, the way it changed a person permanently. I don't regret my service, he concluded, watching the firelight reflect in Michael's attentive eyes. But I want you to understand that it's not just about cool technology or adventure. It's a decision that affects your whole life, even after you're out. Michael was quiet for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick. I want to do something that matters, he said finally. Like you did. There are lots of ways to matter, kiddo. James replied gently. Being smart like you are. That matters. The way you look at the stars and understand what you're seeing, that matters. You don't need a uniform to make a difference. But JROTC is just high school, Michael argued. It doesn't mean I have to enlist later. True, James conceded. And if you're really interested, I'll support that. I just want you to go in with open eyes. Michael nodded, seeming satisfied with this compromise. They fell silent, watching sparks rise from the fire toward the star-filled sky. James, Michael's voice was thoughtful in the darkness. Do you ever think about going back? To Afghanistan or somewhere else? The question stirred something in James. Not the expected pain of memory, but a different sensation, like pressing on a bruise that had begun to heal. Sometimes, he admitted, not because I miss war, but because there's a clarity there, a purpose. Civilian life can feel directionless in comparison, but you have purpose here, Michael said with such certainty that James turned to look at him. You help me. You volunteer at the VA now. You're building things instead of, the opposite. James smiled at the boy's careful avoidance of the word destroying. When did you get so wise? I've always been wise, Michael replied with mock seriousness. You just weren't paying attention. They laughed together, the sound carrying across the still lake. In that moment, James felt a peace he'd almost forgotten was possible. Not the absence of pain or memory, but the presence of something stronger, something healing. He didn't know that in years to come, this conversation would return to him in the most unexpected of circumstances. That the boy beside him would grow into a young man whose path would once again intersect with his own, in a way neither of them could possibly anticipate. For now it was enough to sit beside the fire, to share stories in silence with a friend who saw him clearly. Not just the broken parts, but all of him. In that acceptance, James found something he'd been searching for since returning home. Not just purpose, but belonging. It wasn't perfect. The nightmares would never fully disappear. The memories would always be there, waiting in quiet moments. But so would this. Friendship, connection, a reason to keep moving forward. And for now, that was enough. There's 10 years later. The explosion came without warning, ripping through the marketplace with devastating force. James was thrown backward, debris and dust filling the air as screams erupted around him. For a moment, he was back in Afghanistan, the familiar terror gripping his chest as he struggled to orient himself. But this wasn't Afghanistan. This was Marja Township, a humanitarian mission in the aftermath of a brutal civil conflict that had left the region destabilized and desperate. James had joined the security team for Rebuild International 6 months earlier, using his military experience to protect aid workers as they established medical clinics and food distribution centers. Connor, report. The voice in his earpiece pulled him back to the present. Walsh, the team leader, sounding remarkably calm despite the chaos. I'm good, James responded, pushing himself to his feet and assessing his surroundings. The marketplace was in ruins, smoke billowing from what had been a busy shopping area moments before. Near the south entrance, no visual on hostiles. Medical team needs escort to the blast site. Multiple casualties reported. Can you navigate there? James was already moving, years of training overriding the instinct to seek cover. At 44, he wasn't as fast as he'd been during his military days, but experience compensated for what age had taken. On my way. Status of other teams? East and west side secured. North checkpoint reporting possible secondary device. Proceed with caution. James acknowledged the warning, moving through the panicked crowd with purpose, guiding civilians toward evacuation points while making his way to the medical staging area. The scene was grimly familiar. He'd been through similar scenarios in Afghanistan, in Iraq during a brief contractor stint, in Sudan with his first humanitarian mission. What was different was his response to it. The younger James would have moved through the chaos with emotional detachment, shutting down everything except tactical awareness. Now he remained present, alert to the danger, but also to the humanity around him. He stopped to help an elderly man disoriented by the blast, directed a mother with 2 small children toward the Red Cross tent, checked a young man's bleeding arm, and applied a quick pressure bandage from his kit. These small acts of compassion didn't slow his progress. They were integrated into his movement through the crisis. Years of therapy, of mindfulness practice, of conversations with Michael and other friends had taught him that he could be both the soldier and the human, that effectiveness didn't require emotional shutdown. At the medical staging area, a team of doctors and nurses were preparing to move into the blast zone. James recognized Dr. Abini, the Nigerian physician who'd become a friend over the past months. James, thank God, she called, relief evident in her voice. We need to get to the marketplace now. Reports of at least 30 injured, many critical. I'll clear a path, he promised, checking his weapon. A precaution in a region where bombings were often followed by attacks on first responders. Stay behind me, single file. If I say drop, you drop. Understood? The medical team nodded, faces grim but determined. This wasn't their first crisis response either. As they approached the marketplace, the devastation became fully apparent. The bomb had detonated near a busy food stall, leaving a crater in the earth and destruction radiating outward. People lay wounded on the ground, some already being tended by local responders, others still calling for help. James secured the immediate area, then directed the medical team to begin triage. He maintained a protective position, scanning buildings and rooftops, watching for any sign of a secondary attack. His earpiece crackled with reports from other security teams, creating a composite picture of the situation. So far, no indication of active hostiles. For nearly an hour, he worked alongside the medical team, helping move the wounded to treatment areas, relaying coordinates for emergency evacuations, standing guard as doctors performed life-saving procedures in the dust and rubble. The sun beat down mercilessly, sweat soaking through his tactical vest, but James remained focused and alert. It was during a momentary lull, as the most critical patients had been evacuated and the medical team was regrouping, that James noticed a young local responder working nearby. There was something familiar about his movements, efficient, methodical, with a focus that seemed beyond his apparent years. The young man looked up briefly, pushing glasses up his nose with a gesture that sent a jolt of recognition through James. But it couldn't be James? The young man's voice, deeper than he remembered but with the same inflection, confirmed the impossible. James Connor? Michael? James lowered his weapon slightly, disbelief warring with recognition. What the hell are you doing here? Michael, no longer the skinny 12-year-old with two large glasses but a lean young man of 22, straightened from where he'd been bandaging an elderly woman's arm. I'm with the International Medical Corps, he explained, moving closer. Third-year medical student on my first field rotation. I've been here 3 weeks. His eyes, still the same thoughtful brown behind different frames, widened. I had no idea you were here. Before James could respond, his earpiece crackled urgently. All teams be advised. Potential hostile activity reported near the west checkpoint. Possible armed individuals approaching on motorcycles. Copy that. James responded automatically, then to Michael. We need to move these people. Now. There may be a secondary attack coming. Michael nodded, instantly shifting back to professional mode. We've got 6 patients still needing evacuation. 2 can't walk. Get your team together, James instructed, scanning the area with renewed vigilance. I'll coordinate with my people for immediate extraction. There was no time for reunions or explanations. The next 20 minutes were a blur of coordinated activity as they evacuated the remaining wounded and medical personnel from the marketplace. James stayed at the rear, covering their retreat, hyper-aware of Michael's presence among the medical team he was protecting. It wasn't until they reached the secure compound 2 kilometers away that James could process the shock of seeing Michael in this war-torn corner of the world. The young medical student was helping transfer patients to the field hospital, moving with the confidence of someone already comfortable in crisis situations. When Michael finally approached him again, they were both exhausted, dust-covered, and dealing with the aftermath of adrenaline. Of all the humanitarian crises in all the world, Michael said with a tired smile, you had to walk into mine. The Casablanca reference from one of the classic films they'd watched together years ago broke the tension. James laughed, a short surprise sound that felt strange after the day's horror. Seriously, Michael? Medical Corps? Last I heard, you were still set on astrophysics. Michael shrugged, that familiar gesture now belonging to an adult frame. Things change. I still love the stars, but... He glanced toward the field hospital, where injured civilians were still being treated. I realized I wanted to help people more directly. Medicine seemed like the right path. James studied the young man before him, seeing echoes of the boy he'd known alongside the adult he'd become. Your mother must be worried sick. She is, Michael admitted, but she understands. She's still saving lives in her own way. Head nurse at Memorial now. He hesitated then. I told her I'd seen you. She made me promise to drag you back for dinner when this rotation ends, even if I have to sedate you and stuff you in my luggage. James smiled, remembering Elaine's fierce protective instincts, not just for her son, but eventually for him as well. I've missed her cooking. She's missed having someone appreciate it properly. Michael replied, then grew serious. After you left for that first overseas contract, she checked the casualty reports every day. We both did. The admission caught James off guard. He'd maintained sporadic contact during his international work, occasional emails, rare phone calls when infrastructure permitted, but had never fully realized how his departure had affected them. I'm sorry I didn't stay in better touch, James said quietly. The work took me to some remote places. We understood. Michael's expression held no resentment, only a mature acceptance that made James suddenly aware of how much time had passed. But when I got the assignment here, I never imagined. A commotion at the compound entrance interrupted their conversation. New casualties were arriving, victims of what appeared to be the threatened secondary attack. Without discussion, they both moved back into action. Michael to the medical tent, James to coordinate security with his team. Hours later, as the compound finally quieted under a sky brilliant with stars, they found themselves sitting side by side against a supply crate, too wired for sleep despite bone-deep exhaustion. "You never did tell me how you ended up here," Michael said, passing James a bottle of water. "Last update I got, you were working security for an NGO in Sudan." James took a long drink before answering. "That contract ended 6 months ago. Rebuild International needed experienced security for this mission. The pay is decent, and the work matters." He glanced at Michael. "More importantly, what happened to NASA? You were practically planning your Mars colony when I left." Michael smiled, but there was a shadow behind it. "Remember Todd? The kid who punched me that day?" James nodded, surprised by the reference to their long-ago confrontation. His older brother enlisted right out of high school, stepped on an IED in Afghanistan, lost both legs. Michael stared into the darkness beyond the compound walls. "I saw him when I was home on break from undergrad, in a wheelchair outside the VA hospital. He didn't recognize me, but I recognized him." James waited, sensing there was more to the story. "It hit me then. That could have been you. It could have been anyone. And I thought about all those people in conflict zones who never get the medical care they need, who don't have the resources we have back home." Michael turned to face him. "I decided I could look at the stars for the rest of my life, or I could keep people alive to see them." Seemed like an easy choice. The simplicity of the explanation, delivered without drama or self-importance, reminded James why he'd been drawn to this soul from the beginning. Even as a child, Michael had possessed a clarity about what mattered, a moral compass that pointed true. "Your mom must be proud," James said. "She worries," Michael corrected. "But yeah, she's proud too." He hesitated. "She asks about you, you know, every time I call home. Tell her I'm doing better than I deserve," James replied, a familiar guilt stirring at how thoroughly he'd disconnected from the people who'd helped him heal. "You should tell her yourself," Michael suggested. "When this is over, come back with me. See what's changed. Meet my fiancé." "Fiancé?" James raised an eyebrow, grinning. "The kid who once told me girls were confusing and probably aliens is engaged?" Michael laughed, a flash of his younger self visible in the expression. "Her name is Layla. She's a trauma surgeon. We met in med school. You'd like her. She doesn't take any of my space nonsense too seriously." James felt a genuine happiness for this young man who had once been a lonely boy on apartment steps. "I'd like to meet her. Then you'll come back," Michael pressed, "even just for a visit." Before James could answer, his radio crackled with an emergency alert. "All security personnel to positions. Incoming report of armed insurgents approaching from the southeast." This is not a drill. They were on their feet instantly, the moment of connection broken by the harsh reality of their situation. As they moved in opposite directions, Michael toward the hospital tent to help prepare for possible casualties, James toward the command post. James called after him, "Michael, stay inside the medical area. It's designated as neutral territory. Should be safer." Michael nodded, already shifting into emergency response mode. "Be careful out there." For the next hour, the compound was on high alert. Reports confirmed a group of approximately 20 armed fighters moving toward their location. Though their intentions weren't clear, the security teams took defensive positions, while medical and aid workers sheltered in protected areas. James, positioned at the east wall with 3 other security officers, felt the familiar pre-engagement tension. Heightened senses, measured breathing, tactical awareness expanding to encompass every movement and sound. But there was a new element now. Knowing Michael was inside, potentially in danger if the compound's defenses failed. This was different from protecting anonymous aid workers, important as that duty was. This was protecting someone whose life had intertwined with his own, someone he'd watched grow from child to man. The stakes felt personally, painfully higher. When the attack came, it was swift and coordinated. The insurgents had clearly studied the compound's security protocols, targeting the weakest points with precision. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, accompanied by the distinctive thump of RPG launchers being prepared. "RPG! Southeast corner." The warning came through James's headset seconds before the explosion rocked the compound wall, sending debris and smoke skyward. In the chaos that followed, James maintained his position, returning fire when targets presented themselves, coordinating with the other security teams via radio. The attackers were well armed, but faced determined resistance from the compound's defenders. Then came the call he'd been dreading. Medical taking fire! East side of the hospital tent. We need immediate support. James didn't hesitate. Moving to medical, he reported, already sprinting across the compound, staying low as bullets cracked overhead. 2 other security officers followed his lead, providing covering fire as they advanced. The scene at the hospital tent was nightmarish. An RPG had torn through the eastern wall, leaving a gaping hole and scattered debris. Staff and patients were huddled behind makeshift barriers, while a few brave medical workers continued treating the injured despite the danger. James scanned the chaos, heart pounding. Michael? He called, moving deeper into the damaged structure. Michael Tanner. Here. The response came from behind an overturned supply cabinet, where Michael was applying pressure to a woman's bleeding thigh. We've got critical patients who can't be moved. James assessed the situation quickly. The east side was exposed to enemy fire, with only canvas and light structural supports between the medical area and the attackers. They needed to secure this section immediately or evacuate. We need to get everyone to the west side of the tent, he told the other security officers. It's reinforced with concrete barriers. Safer there. As they began coordinating the movement of patients, gunfire intensified outside. James positioned himself between the damaged wall and the medical area, providing cover as staff began moving the wounded. Michael worked alongside the other medical personnel, his focus absolute despite the danger. They had almost completed the evacuation to the safer section when James spotted movement outside the tent, shadows approaching rapidly through the smoke. Hostiles closing in, he warned, raising his weapon. Everyone down. The next few moments unfolded with terrible clarity. 3 armed men appeared at the opening in the tent wall, weapons raised. James fired, taking down the first, while the other security officers engaged the remaining attackers. But in the confusion, a 4th insurgent, unseen until now, lobbed a grenade through the opening. It bounced across the floor, rolling toward the remaining medical workers and patients. Grenade! James shouted, already moving. Without conscious thought, he lunged forward, intending to cover the explosive with his body, the ultimate sacrifice to protect those behind him. But someone else moved faster. Michael appeared from nowhere, grabbing the grenade and throwing it back through the opening in one fluid motion. The explosive detonated outside the tent, the force of the blast still knocking them both backward. For a moment, everything went silent for James. The gunfire, the shouts, all muted as if underwater. He saw Michael sprawled on the ground several feet away, unmoving. Fear, cold and absolute, gripped his chest. Then the world rushed back in. James crawled to Michael's side, checking for injuries with desperate hands. Michael, can you hear me? The young medic's eyes fluttered open, dazed but conscious. Did I get it out? He asked, voice barely audible above the continued fighting. You got it out, James confirmed, relief making his voice unsteady. What the hell were you thinking? Thinking I didn't want to see you die, Michael replied, grimacing as he tried to sit up. Figured I owed you one. Before James could respond, gunfire erupted directly outside their position. With no time for words, he dragged Michael behind a concrete barrier, just as bullets tore through the space where they'd been. Stay down, James ordered, checking his weapon. I need to secure this section. Michael grabbed his arm, surprising strength in his grip. Together, he insisted. I can still help. In any other circumstance, James would have refused. Protecting civilians was his job, not theirs. But something in Michael's eyes stopped him. This wasn't the boy he'd once shielded from bullies. This was a man making his own choices, even in danger. Stay behind me, James conceded. And if I say run, you run. No arguments. Michael nodded, his expression solemn. Understood. What followed was 20 minutes of the most intense combat James had experienced since his military days. The insurgents were determined to breach the medical area, perhaps seeking hostages or simply wanting to inflict maximum casualties. James and the security team were equally determined to prevent it. Through it all, Michael remained by his side, passing ammunition when needed, helping move injured staff to safer positions, even using a discarded weapon to provide covering fire when James had to reload. They moved like partners who had trained together for years, anticipating each other's needs without words. When reinforcements finally arrived and the attackers retreated, The medical tent was still standing, damaged but intact, its occupants shaken but mostly alive. As the immediate danger passed, the reality of what had happened settled over James. Michael, the boy he had protected years ago, had risked his life to save James and everyone in that tent. The grenade would have killed or severely injured at least a dozen people had it detonated inside. He found Michael sitting on a supply crate outside the damaged tent, being examined by another doctor despite his protests that he was fine. Just bruises and a mild concussion, Michael reported as James approached. Nothing serious. James sat beside him, the adrenaline crash making his hands shake slightly. You saved lives in there. A lot of lives. Michael shrugged, that familiar gesture now carrying the weight of a man's humility rather than a boy's dismissal. I did what anyone would do. No, James said firmly. You didn't. What you did, throwing back a live grenade, that's not something anyone does. That's something only a few would even attempt. Michael was quiet for a moment, watching as wounded were loaded into transport vehicles for evacuation to a more secure facility. When I was a kid, he said finally, I used to imagine being brave like you, standing up to danger, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. He glanced at James. I never told you this, but the day you stepped between me and those bullies changed everything for me. It was the first time anyone besides my mom had ever fought for me. James felt a tightness in his throat. You were worth fighting for. So are you. Michael replied simply. So are all these people. He gestured toward the medical tent, where staff continued treating patients despite the night's violence. That's why we're both here, isn't it? Different methods, same mission. In that moment, looking at this young man who had once been a bullied boy, with 2 large glasses and a brilliant mind, James felt a profound sense of completion, as if a circle had been drawn around 10 years of friendship, mentorship, separation, and reunion. An ex-soldier stood up for a bullied kid, James said quietly, echoing the words that had once been just a news headline. Unaware the boy would later save his life in battle. Michael smiled, recognition lighting his eyes. Sounds like a good story. It is, James agreed, looking out at the star-filled sky above their battered compound. One of the best I know. In the quiet that followed, as the compound slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy and the stars continued their ancient journey overhead, James made a decision. When this mission ended, he would go home with Michael. He would reconnect with Elaine, meet Michael's fiancée, perhaps even consider a future that didn't require constant movement, constant distance. For so long, he had defined himself by what war had taken from him. Peace of mind, physical wholeness, comrades lost. But sitting beside this young man who had grown from their unlikely friendship into someone of extraordinary courage and compassion, James realized that perhaps the most important parts of his story weren't about loss at all. They were about what remained, what grew, what transformed. An ex-soldier and a once bullied boy, now men who had saved each other in ways that transcended a single heroic moment, a friendship that had weathered absence and distance, only to prove its strength in the most extreme circumstances. When we get out of here, James said, I think I'll take you up on that dinner invitation. Michael's smile widened. Mom will be thrilled. And Layla's been wanting to meet the famous James Connor ever since I told her about the meteor shower. Famous, huh? In our house? Absolutely. Michael's expression turned serious. You changed my life, you know. Even when you weren't there, you were still influencing the choices I made, the person I wanted to be. The words humbled James in a way few things could. Works both ways, kid. More than you know. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they sat in companionable silence. 2 warriors of different kinds, bound by years, experience, and a chance encounter on a rainy afternoon long ago. The compound around them buzzed with activity, the wounded being treated, defenses being reinforced, the work of healing continuing despite the night's violence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But for now, in this moment between darkness and light, there was just this: connection, survival, the quiet victory of 2 lives that had shaped each other in ways neither could have imagined when their paths first crossed. An unlikely friendship that had, in the end, saved them both.